Welcome to the Aviation Investor Club podcast, the global mastermind for high net worth and sophisticated investors with a passion for aviation. Today, we're honored to be joined by a true legend in the aviation world, Captain David Koch. With a career spanning over 65 years, Captain Koch has done it all, from flying military helicopters in the US Army to commanding commercial jets at United Airlines. He's founded multiple charter companies and flight schools, authored several aviation books, and led industry organizations that shape the future of flight. Well beyond the cockpit, Captain Koch has been a pioneer in aviation entrepreneurship, investment strategy, and even commercial space exploration, having served as a special assistant to the president of United Airlines for space shuttle acquisition. He's also the mind behind Captain Dave AI, combining his lifetime of experience into modern tech to help guide the next generation of aviation professionals and investors. So whether you're already flying high in aviation finance or just taxiing onto the runway, this episode promises insight, perspective, and stories you won't find anywhere else. Captain Koch, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure being here and an honor.
You're welcome. So I'll start off with the very early origins and the early influences of what brought you into aviation. So you began your flying journey back in 1958. What was the moment or experience that first drew you into aviation?
I think it actually began in the late 40s. I was born shortly after World War II. And at the time, aviation was huge in the world. It was growing rapidly. There was a lot of information flowing about aviation. And most of the boys in my cohort wanted to be pilots. Part of that was, of course, the World War II propaganda flicks that were being broadcast on the TV stations at the time. We saw a lot of John Wayne movies when he was the hero fighter pilot. We all wanted to be just like him. So I think that was the spark, to answer your question precisely, that got me interested in aviation, like many other young men at the time. But the opportunity in 1958, when I took my first flying lesson, I was very fortunate that my grandmother always supported my dreams, and she purchased my first flying lesson for me. And in fact, she was about 80 years old at the time, and she went along on the flying lesson. So it was the first time she had ever been in an airplane and the first time I had ever been in an airplane. So that was quite an adventure. But the reinforcement I got from the flight instructor and the other pilots at the airport encouraged me to keep pursuing my dream of becoming a pilot. And now this is 50s and 60s. The zeitgeist in America was you could achieve your dreams. You just had to work hard, get good mentors, follow what they told you to do, and you could do anything. So I had that spirit. And of course, anybody that's watching today who is a pilot knows that you have to have a lot of internal motivation to achieve any goals in aviation. So that's where that came from. And I just kept taking flying lessons whenever I could earn enough money to buy one. I took one, and by the time I got out of high school at 18, I had all my professional ratings and licenses. So I started flight instructing even before I got out of high school, and since I turned 18. And then because the aviation industry was expanding rapidly, just like it is today in most sectors, the airlines were hiring a bunch of pilots and corporate aviation was expanding rapidly. I had all kinds of opportunities. So within a year, I was a corporate pilot flying single engine piston corporate airplanes and light twin engine piston corporate airplanes. And then again, I got lucky. United Airlines hired me when I was 19, but they told me I was going to have to wait a year and a half to start because 21 was the minimum age. So in the meantime, I didn't want to be bored. I did two things. I went into the U.S. Army National Guard and learned how to be a helicopter crew chief and door gunner. And that was because of the draft here in the U.S. at the time with the Vietnam War. And then I started a charter company, which was my first aviation venture when I was 19. And it was successful, grew rapidly. But a year and a half, 2 years later, I was already working for United, and they transferred me to New York from Chicago, where I was based, where I had the charter company. So I sold it to my partners, who were my mentors and backers in that business, and went off to fly for United. However, shortly thereafter, the first oil embargo took place, and the seniority at United slowed down. and you progress as an airline pilot based on your seniority. So it wasn't moving. I was frustrated. So I went back to my entrepreneurial bent and started a company that was, as far as I know, the first formal, organized private aviation like ground school and flight school for hang gliding. And we also manufactured hang gliders, and it was a successful business, but it was a seasonal business, summertime, spring to fall here in Chicago area. In the winter, after about the third year of that, I was trying to decide what to do next because I like to do startups. I'm not a maintainer. So that was going well, but what's next? I had the what's next, but that required at that time about a $30 million investment. And I was in my late 20s and I couldn't convince anybody I knew what I was talking about. I was frustrated. And I saw an announcement in Airline Pilot magazine. I was a member of the Airline Pilot Association, that NASA was hiring their first group of shuttle astronauts that didn't have to be test pilots. So I was qualified as a United pilot, basically qualified to become a NASA astronaut. Of course, I had always also been interested in spaceflight, so I couldn't resist the temptation. It was wintertime. I drove down to Houston where it was warm and went into the Johnson Space Center to announce, here I am, I'm ready to be hired, the world's first airline pilot astronaut. And I got the typical big government bureaucracy. Here's 3 inches of paper, take it and read it and come back and fill out the forms and submit them and we'll let you know. So I was frustrated with that. And I went back to the hotel and thought about it that evening. And I had just had a couple of articles published on ballooning and hang gliding. So technically I was a published writer, aviation writer. So I went back into the public affairs office at NASA the next day and said, hey, here I am. I'm a published writer. I'm a airline pilot. I want to write an article for Airline Pilot magazine about how you become a shuttle astronaut if you're not a military pilot. Luckily, there again, luck plays a big part. The public affairs officer was very helpful and interested. And he took me around the center and introduced me to everybody. But I've got to tell this war story because it's unknown and I think interesting. He took me in to interview John Young and Deke Slayton. Now, if you're not interested in the space program, you might not know who they were, but Deke Slayton was in the original Mercury and John Young was in the Gemini group. And they were both running the astronaut corps and of the space shuttle program at the time. I was brought in to interview him and I didn't really know what to ask him, but one question I had was coming from an airline pilot because NASA's party line at the time was that they were going to turn over commercial space shuttle operations to the private sector as soon as the orbital flight test period was completed in about a year and a half. So the natural question I had to Slayton and Young was, do you think airline pilots are going to be flying the shuttle in the near future? And I thought it was an easy one for them because they would come back with a party line. Sure. And then I could write that down in the article for airline pilots and everybody would have been happy. That's not what happened. They started giggling like a couple little girls. And after they calmed down, I said, well, excuse me, what was so funny about that question? And they looked at each other and John Young said, an airline pilot could never learn to fly the space shuttle. Now, if you're a pilot, you know that pilots are highly susceptible to challenges.
Yeah.
And that was the challenge of a lifetime. And luckily, the public affairs officer, Milt Ream, said after the interview, he said, I apologize. All astronauts are arrogant. That shouldn't have asked that or shouldn't answer that way. But I'll tell you what, Dave, if you want to prove them wrong, I can help you out. I said, how's that? He said, I can get you into the space shuttle simulator. I can get you into all the ground schools. I can get you a press pass so that you are like an employee here at the Johnson Space Center. You'll have free access and you can prove they're wrong. And so I took him up on his offer. And 3 years later, I had about 125 hours in the shuttle simulator. I had proven to all the NASA instructors I could fly it. And I'd been through all the ground school stuff. And I was thinking about leaving United. My seniority was still stagnant and shooting for an astronaut job. But of course, that would have meant taking half pay to fly maybe once a year versus flying a jet every week. Was going to do that. And then at a dinner one night, of the American Society, I'm sorry, the Association of the Professionals, including the astronauts in the aerospace business, is the name of the organization. I was chairman of their publicity committee, and I was sitting on the dais with one of the pioneers in spaceflight. And he asked me if I thought United Airlines would be interested in teaming with NASA to do the commercial space shuttle operations. I said, I don't know, Bob, but I'll go find out. So I went to United. And again, this story is very interesting, but I'll compress it. Took about a year and a half, and I became special assistant to the president of United for space shuttle acquisition. We tried to get the contracts for operating the space shuttle commercially. Unfortunately, this was in the transition period of airline deregulation in the early 80s, and the company focus was elsewhere. Let me put it that way. There was a lot of internal politics. So this is another very interesting story. But by 1984, United was starting to back out of the operation. And then in 86, Challenger, we had the Challenger disaster, and that was all. I went back to flying airplanes for United, doing other things, starting other aviation-related businesses that, again, we could spend a lot of time talking about, but I won't go into detail at this time. And finished out my career at United in 1990. I took an early retirement because I had a business venture. Then I had commitment for a $30 million investment. And the investors said, Dave, we appreciate the fact that you love flying those jets for United, but if we're going to invest $30 million, we'd like to have your full attention. I said, well, I understand that. So I kind of resigned from United. I took early retirement in 1990. And then, unfortunately, the Gulf War broke out a few months later. And the investors, which were some Japanese bankers, said, we're going to wait and see what happens. I had purchase contracts on a big simulator training company, simulator manufacturing company, training company, on FBO, and I had a lot of commitments out there, but the bankers were holding back to see what happened in the war, and everything fell apart. It went on too long. It went on a year and a half, so everything fell apart. So that dream wasn't realized, but it's still part of my thinking and planning and part of some of the business models that I'm working on. Since that time, I've been doing various, what I'll call stretch entrepreneurial projects way out there. Like, for example, one of them is to develop a network of hypersonic business jets for high-speed travel around the planet. Those kinds of things that are really, most people think they're impossible to do. So that's where I'm at in my career right now, is I like those kinds of challenges.
Very fascinating. It's like you've done a lot that people couldn't even imagine in a lifetime, and you're still going for more. It's like unbelievable. So you've nearly flown, or should I say, you've flown in nearly every sector. You've done military, you've done space, you've done airline, you've done corporate, you've done instructional. So which of those environments taught you the most then about leadership and risk?
They are, I don't know if I could single one out because they all have. And in the thing that's always amazing to me, how similar the thinking and the philosophies and the processes are in identifying and managing risk and leadership in all of those areas. But in the airline industry, of course, that's where I got formal training on leadership, risk management. And then, of course, that was followed up in the military, reinforced, I should say, in the military. But when you get into business, the same techniques, methodologies that you use in terms of leadership and in terms of risk identification, management, mitigation, and so forth, apply. So I think it's been across the board, David.
Okay. So you've launched then several aviation businesses, as you've mentioned. So when evaluating an aviation venture or startup today, what are the key things that you're looking for?
Actually, it's the one key thing, the first key I looked for was this one. I looked for my first business, my second one, third one, and that's where is their demand? So I always go to the demand first to make sure I totally understand the demand, the psychology of the people who generate that demand, and so forth. And then the other key issues are, can you build a model that can satisfy the demand in a cost-effective way and leave room for an attractive profit when you're all done delivering. So those are the main key things: demand first, and then can you create the solution that makes everybody happy, delivers the service in an exceptional way for the customer, but
Mm.
provides an attractive return for everybody who's made an investment.
Yeah. So what makes aviation investing unique compared to other industries, in your opinion, then?
Wow, and that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. It is.
Mm.
And I think the antithesis of that is that I have seen so many very smart, successful business people come into the aviation sector and decide they're going to get rich in the aviation sector and fall on their face and lose a lot of money. And that's where that old adage comes from, I believe. How
Yeah.
do you make $1 million in the aviation industry? Start with 100 million, right?
Yeah.
I think that's where that comes from, because a lot of people have broken their pick that way, because the nuances and subtleties of the business are the make or break factors. And they're counterintuitive in a lot of instances. And unless you have that breadth of experience, depth and breadth of experience, and or have a team that has that, then you're not going to be successful. In other words, there are many ways to fail.
Yeah, as they say. So, what's one common myth then that you've identified, like of investors that they often believe in, but it's false when they're trying to do the aviation investing?
I think that the big one is that you can treat the elements of the business, the equipment, the customers, the marketing, just like you treat any other business. And in some sense, you can. It's not entirely different. But again, coming back to what makes the successful venture is on the margins. It's the nuances. It's that deep knowledge, deep insights that gives you that edge. So let me come up with an example. I think here's an example, and we touched on it before: knowing your customer. If you don't know that the kind of guy that will put his heart and soul and pocketbook into aviation has to see it as a challenge and has to have a passion for it, then you're not going to be able to market to them successfully. You'll try to use logic and analysis and everything else. And as we know, I'm not a salesman. I've never been a salesman, but I have an ex-wife who is a saleswoman. I have a son who's a salesman. I have a brother who's a successful salesman. I have an ex-wife who's a successful salesperson. But I've never been a salesman, but I do know this, that if you are going to sell to your market, you have got to understand them as well as you understand yourself. And what the old sales guys that taught me always said, Dave, what you have to remember is you got to sell the sizzle, not the steak. So the steak is the analysis. It's got to be there, the justifications and the logic. But that's not why people buy. They buy that sizzle. They buy on passion. They buy on challenge or whatever motivates them. So that's one example. That's probably one big example where I've seen guys that don't understand that, trying to sell something to pilots.
Yep.
It just doesn't work.
Yeah. Going back then, using that sizzle analogy in sales and stuff, you were part of United Airlines in the very, very early days of the commercial, in quotes, space efforts, because it didn't quite go in the direction. So what was that experience like? And how did you see the future of aviation and space cross over with the investment back in those days? Because it's an unknown world and it didn't go as planned, as we know. But back in those days, it must have been phenomenal. So can you go into some examples of what, because you lived it, what was your experience like and how do you see the future of space aviation?
Sure. This is late 70s, early 80s when I was involved. And of course, at that time, even though those of us who were advocates for space development were frustrated because things were moving too slowly, we thought, of course, we always do, was that the thinking, the history, the thinking, the open-mindedness of the public was there for space development. In other words, from the 50s on, with all that propaganda I mentioned earlier and all of that, we all were made to believe that we were going to have the ability to travel to and from other planets in the solar system, other places in the solar system out in space, easily, freely. The typical Joe would be able to afford it. And this was going to happen. And we all pretty much believed it, except for those folks who became cynical when it didn't happen on a very fast pace. But in the late 70s and early 80s, those of us that knew what was going on looked at the technology. And with the space shuttle, that was the breakthrough. However, we knew the space shuttle was not the answer. The space shuttle was just the breakthrough. The space shuttle was never, we believed, and I still believe, was never going to provide us with safe, reliable, cost-effective transportation to and from surface of the Earth and low Earth orbit. It's a rocket ship. Rocket ships blow up, unfortunately. They're too complicated. The operational requirements are too strenuous compared to airlines. Airlines have almost 100% safety record. Elon Musk, he's blowing up every third rocket or something, or every other rocket. It's just that the rockets are not the answer. So what I learned at the time, or what I actually had learned before that, what was reinforced from people like Wernher von Braun and Buzz Aldrin and all those kinds of folks that I worked with at the time, was that the answer is the next step from the space shuttle. And the next step from the space shuttle is what we all call the aerospace plane. So visualize the Concorde, the supersonic airliner. It'd be a vehicle of about that size and shape. Visualize that the aerospace plane can take off from any commercial airport in the world. It needs about a 10,000-foot runway. And take off and climb out and keep on climbing and accelerating until it gets up to about 200 miles and about 17,500 miles an hour. And then it's in low Earth orbit. And then it rendezvous with space stations. We've all seen the story, right? And then it undocks, flies back down, it lands at any other commercial airport on the planet. That's the aerospace plane. When you have the aerospace plane, you not only can go from the surface of the Earth up to low Earth orbit, but you can go from point to point on Earth. So you take off from O'Hare and go to Beijing, but instead of taking 14 hours to fly like it does today to fly from Chicago to Beijing, it takes you 1 hour. So that's the capability the aerospace plane gives you. That's what I learned about back then. That's what I've believed in ever since. And I have a business model that addresses capturing that opportunity because I believe the aerospace plane, the technology will be developed to the point where we can have that within the next 15 to 20 years.
Okay, so still quite new. Yeah, so go into this. Yep. So that's a good blend, you could say, into what you're currently doing on now. So now you're at the bleeding edge of AI, and you're blending the aviation AI together with Captain Dave AI. So how do you see AI impacting flight training, operations, and even investor due diligence? And what is, in a nutshell, Captain AI? Because we're starting to get the picture, as you have been at the cutting edge since your very beginning, and you're going and you're pushing and pushing. You are really like one of those space jocks, as a persona. You are that sort of guy. So how are you blending that together? And tell us a little bit about Captain Dave AI.
Sure. Like everyone else, I think in business, I really became aware of AI about 2 years ago with ChatGPT and when all of that kerfuffle happened. And so I've been studying it, learning as much about it ever since. And I have a concept for, or a model for, an AI mentor, which really, though, is much more than that. And I've been getting quotes on that from developers. And so I'm fairly well up to speed on that process and costs and all of that involved with developing Captain Dave AI at this point. But before we get into Captain Dave AI, let me say that Captain Dave AI is just the spear that we're going to use to open up a much, much bigger market and capture a much more exciting opportunity. That is, I look at it as the first of 4 steps that end with that aerospace plane flying from the surface of the Earth up and back to low Earth orbit. Captain Dave AI, let me give you some background. I call it personal flying. And let me define that because that's not in any FAA manual or the dictionary. Personal flying, in my definition, is that's somebody who buys or rents an airplane, learns to fly for their own personal business and or leisure travel. So they're not in it to make money. They're not in it to charter the airplane. They just want to fly it themselves, but they have that passion to learn to fly. They want to fly. That's the big part. That's the sizzle. It's not
Yeah.
the transportation part. That's the steak. And we can talk about the advantages of that. But the sizzle is those people who have that desire. And back from World War II through early 1980s in the US, because that's the market I'm familiar with, it was similar in Europe, but not as robust by any means as it was in the US for several reasons. But market was growing rapidly. And we had about, like, by 1980, we had about 5,000 private airports in the US, not airline airports, not the big ones, private or small airports, let me call them that, in the US. And every small airport had on it what we called an FBO, Foxtrot Bravo Oscar, fixed base operator. And in case your listeners don't know, give a little history. Back when there were barnstormers in the 20s, those were the guys that got together and bought old World War I airplanes and flew around giving people rides. Some of them started to settle down in the late 20s on airports, and they opened up flight schools and maintenance, and they sold airplanes, and they called themselves fixed base operators rather than barnstormers. So FBOs have been on our airports since the 20s, and by the early 80s, we had about more than 5,000 of them here. And they all provided similar services, 6 departments. So they provided flight training, aircraft rental, aircraft sales, aircraft maintenance, charter, and aircraft storage. Six departments usually. Now, some of them wouldn't have all 6, but almost everyone did. And it was one of the best businesses ever. It was like a car dealership on steroids, right? Because you brought in the customer and they paid you to teach them how to drive. And then before they could buy their own airplane, or if they couldn't afford it, you rented one to them. And then once they could afford to buy their own airplane, they bought one from you. And then you maintained it, you stored it for them. And when they had a business trip or so forth, their airplane wasn't capable, they charter your jet and go to. So it was incredible business. A lot of synergy, 6 good revenue streams. That network was growing and robust up until the early 80s. Here's what happened. And I wrote a book about this. So I did a lot of research. So this just is an opinion. It's at very least an educated. What happened was in the early 80s, there were 3 major aircraft manufacturers of personal airplanes, Cessna, Beech, and Piper. We've all heard of them, right? And of course, you notice those names. That was the Cessna family, the Beech family, and the Piper family. They were family-owned businesses up until the early 80s. They knew they were in the community. They knew pilots. They knew how to sell to them, how to retain their loyalty over the years, and continually upgrade them, right? Upsell them. Then in the early 80s, Cessna got bought by General Dynamics, a major U.S. aerospace manufacturer. Beech got bought by Raytheon, same thing. Piper got bought by Forsman Little, which is one of the first private equity groups on Wall Street back in the boom of the early 80s of the junk bond world. That was the money was flowing and there was investment everywhere. So the 3 manufacturers of personal airplanes got purchased by those big companies. Cessna and Beech were the leaders. Piper was just because it was a bunch of New York bankers who thought they could make money in aviation and didn't know the business, just followed the lead of Cessna and Beech. They did what they did. So and I'd already, by having my experience in the aerospace industry, I totally believe this, that when Raytheon and General Dynamics bean counters went in to look at Cessna and Beech, they looked at the product mix. And they said, look, you're making military aircraft and parts, business aircraft and parts. You're selling them. The pilots that fly those aircraft are professionals. They're working in professional organizations. The safety record's much better. On those personal airplanes, though, you're not making much money because there's a lot of competition. You got thousands of people literally hammering them together by hand, and we're not making much money on them. And that in the early 80s is when the product liability awards for personal flying accidents started to skyrocket. They went from $1 million or 2 per accident to 10 million. And that was big money in the early 80s. The bean counter said, why are we making these little personal airplanes? We're not making much money on them. We got all this risk, and we can divert the workforce over to where we're making. So anyhow, they literally, in the early 80s, like in a year or two after they bought those companies, stopped making personal airplanes, single engine piston airplanes. Just stopped. Cool. Piper kept going, but they cut way back. And so they back. Problem was that up until that point, those three companies provided all of the marketing for personal flying. They did what I call the institutional advertising, the magazine ads, the TV ads. They provide. When I ran a flight school in the 60s, they provided me with all of my marketing materials. They paid for my magazine ads, my yellow page ads. Anybody know what those were?
Yeah.
And they trained me. So when they stopped making airplanes, they stopped selling. And you could see it in the numbers. We had 150,000 new student starts a year, actually a little bit more than that, every year in the U.S. And as soon as Cessna Beach stopped making those airplanes and stopped selling personal flying, we went to 50,000 student starts a year. Been there ever since. So that's what caused it. That's the root cause, in my opinion, of what caused it to personal flying to start going downhill. But isn't that great? Because what caused it can be fixed.
Yeah.
We just got to get out there and sell it. Of course, now the infrastructure has atrophied, so we have to rebuild the infrastructure, but that's not difficult to do. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, but it's not all that difficult to do. We know how to do it, and the resources are there to do it. It can be done. So that's Captain Dave is the marketing tool, the market retention tool, the upgrading tool, all of that for the folks who will be members of the aero clubs that we're going to establish.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So, at the moment, then you've like had over, was it 18,000 hours of flight time or something equivalent to that? And so you've seen the industry evolve dramatically. So how do you define this airmanship excellence today? Is that done with Captain Dave AI, or how do you capture that together? Is that the big part of what it's all about?
Great question. Yeah. The other big aspect of making these aero clubs successful is solving the problem with the personal flying accident rate.
Yep.
As I mentioned earlier, and we all know the airline accident rate is almost zero, right? Fatal. It's not perfect, but it's close, especially given the volume. Personal flying, there in the U.S., there are about 1.5 fatal accidents a day in the U.S.
Great.
So it's a bad accident rate, which doesn't discourage the customer, by the way. Most pilots are adventurous seekers. But what it does discourage is the significant others who have a say in their purchase decision, the pilot's purchase decision. So you got to solve the safety problem, and because it's not good. But that's very doable because the way the airlines got to their magnificent safety record is through airmanship excellence. And that's known as crew resource management, cockpit resource management. That's the technical term. Safety management systems. That's the technical term. Those are all part of the philosophy that came into the airline industry in the early 80s. And I was at United, actually late 70s, early 80s. I was at United at the time. So I was part of that transition, and I was part of developing the new way of practicing airmanship. And I call that Airmanship 2.0. So the idea is you take the way that professional pilots practice airmanship and their support structure, like dispatch operations, in-flight communications, automation, all those different things that the professional pilots use to keep it real safe, and provide them to the personal flyers. And that can be done. And it can be done cost effectively. And I believe personally that when we do that, we'll bring that personal flying accident rate down to where the airlines are, remove that barrier to entry, and bring many more people into personal flying.
Yep. That if that happens, then obviously that would be like a global like saving as well. So you could potentially be saving thousands and thousands, if not millions of lives over a lifetime. That's a significant sort of input there. So
and you bring the cost down by doing that. Product liability all that stuff comes down. You increase the volume of aircraft being sold, so product liability premiums come down. But also with Captain Dave AI and with that approach to flying, to how you train pilots and so forth, we can reduce the time it takes for somebody to learn to fly back to where it used to be. For example, in the heyday of personal flying, you could get a private pilot license here in the US with about 40 hours of flight time. And almost everybody got it right around 40 to 50 hours of flight time. That was typical. If you went to 60 or more, we discouraged you from continuing to learn to fly. Although, in some cases, one of the biggest drivers of that higher time is not taking lessons often enough. It's learning skills, so you got to repeat often to do it. But basically, everybody got their private in 40 hours. The average right now in the US for a private pilot is just under 100 hours. So
a bit of a difference.
More than double the time, more than double the cost, more than double the frustration, more than double the resistance you're going to get from your significant others. And as a result, we used to have about a 30% dropout rate from the time a person said, I'm going to be a private pilot till they got their license, 30% dropout. Today, it's 70 to 80% dropout rate. So we can reduce that back to that 20 to 30% dropout, probably less, because we have much more effective training tools now than we had back then. Simulation was just gotten to the point where we can replace hours and hours in the airplane with ground training and bring the cost down and the time.
Okay. So then from an investor point of view, because obviously the investors are the ones that could potentially be sponsoring this and making it go forward. Let's assume the investor's new to aviation. Like they know aviation, but they're new to like investing. So what are some blind spots or red flags that they should be wary of then? Because it sounds like there's opportunity, but don't just rush in. What would you say would be the blind spots and red flags?
Well, again, coming back to knowing the industry, you have to know in this case what kind of aircraft that you're going to use and how you're going to deploy them. How you sell those aircraft, sales is a big part of it. And also there's opportunities to acquire controlling interest in the manufacturers of these aircraft. They're very small companies at this point, and they can be acquired fairly easy. They do change hands periodically. Again, you have to have that kind of deep insight into what kind of equipment is going to be the right kind of equipment to do this. And if you don't know that, then I would call that a blind spot. You could easily follow the crowd. For example, this is a good example. The crowd today they're all following each other, and almost every flight school in the country today, in the world today, is using 30 to 50-year-old airplanes. Now imagine a car, 30 to 50-year-old, you're about to drive this car. And yes, they're better maintained than a car, but they're 30 to 50 years old. They're falling apart. They literally are falling apart. Engines are quitting. That's part of the reason for that high fatal accident rate. Back in the day when things worked with the FBOs, like we were talking about before, when a student came out to learn to fly, it was in a brand new airplane. Why was it a brand new airplane? The sales department of the FBO brought the airplane on, floor planned it, we called it, and had it on the floor for people to look at and test fly, but they also made money off it by giving flying lessons and renting it while they were doing it. And you had to have new airplanes. Today, they're using old airplanes. And that sizzle factor, right? But it's also the state factor. There's logic in you're safer flying a new airplane for many reasons than flying a 30 to 40-year-old airplane. So I guess that would be an example of blind spot and where you could really go wrong.
Because now you come to mention it, to me, I didn't think like a 70-year-old plane was that old, but apparently that is an old plane now, considering for those sort of things. But it is, when you think about it, even my training, I did it in a 70-year-old plane, 80-year-old for 1980s, sorry, 1970s, not 70-year-old, but 1970s, 1980s sort of plane. That's about 30-year-old now. So I hadn't thought of it that way, but now you mention it, it's like, that is so obvious. So thanks for that. So you've written several books. And so which one of those books, because you've written several of them, you can mention the titles if you want to now, but which one of those books would you feel investors should read first? And what's the main takeaway from that particular book?
Let me answer that question by talking about all of them, because they're all germane to what we're talking about. The first book title was Jet Airline Pilot, What It Means to Be One, How to Become One.
Yeah.
And I did that in the early 80s. And actually, initially, it was what was we called back then an audiogram. It was audio cassette tapes, the little ones,
Yeah.
with a printed workbook put together. That was called an audiogram. That was before videotapes. And then I turned it into a book later. But at any rate, that the title explains it all. And I wrote that or produced it as a marketing tool for Airline Pilot Training Academy that I had going at the time. That's the $30 million investment I talked about earlier. We're going to
Yep.
expand that. That was the first one. But part of our Aero Club network, there's a strong, robust revenue stream for training airline pilots in addition to personal flyers. Personal flyer market's much bigger, but there's a strong market for training professional pilots. So that's germane, the book. Second book I wrote was in the 2001, and that was called Vault Security, The Real Story About Airline Safety. And that was a Captain X book. I had left United by then, and I wanted to talk about a lot of the safety issues that are still there and gotten worse in the airline industry. And in fact, I haven't gotten on an airliner since the year 2000 because of what I know. And that leads into another opportunity in business aviation that we haven't talked about. That is actually the second step after aero clubs on the way to aerospace planes, has to do with business jets, a network of scheduled business jets. But that flows into that, the book Vault Security. The third book I wrote, which is really the manifesto, if you will, for the aero clubs we were just talking about, and that's called A Personal Flyer's Guide to More Enjoyable Flying. So I'd suggest that book for anybody that's interested in Captain Dave AI and the aero clubs, the personal flying things we've been talking about. That's focused right on that opportunity. And then I wrote the book titled Air Traveler's Heaven, which was the counterpoint to Vault Security, the real story about airline safety. And that's all about that step I just mentioned of the network of scheduled business jets.
Yeah.
So if they're interested in that, I'd recommend that book.
Okay. It sounds good. So out of all of those three, so there's a couple of recommendations and takeaways, obviously from the pilot sort of stage all the way through to where they were to get today. So coming back to the investors then, so if you were to sit down with a young investor or maybe like somebody that's getting new into aviation, that's young sort of thing, maybe not age-wise into industry, just entering aviation. So what's your most honest piece of advice that you would give to them?
It would be, don't try to go it alone, even though you might be successful in other businesses.
Yeah.
Build a team that really knows the business and listen to them. Of course, that's a challenge because if you don't know the business, somebody who might sound like they know the business, they really don't. So that's a real challenge. But that's my biggest piece of advice. And if you're not going to try to do it yourself or do it with a team, then find the people that have the experience and know the ways to do it and the ways not to do it, which are at least as important as the ways to do it.
Yeah. Look at this. So if you have to look like then 10 years ahead, okay, or maybe even 20 years, yeah, 10, 20 years ahead. So what aviation or aerospace innovation excites you the most from an investor's perspective? So you've mentioned already having the international travel, outer space, etc. But what's the innovation that excites you the most out of that from an investor's perspective, not only the pilot side of things?
Yeah. And I haven't answered that, but let me answer that in the context of the four large areas of opportunity that I see, because we've talked about two of them, we've mentioned one of them, and we haven't even talked about the other one yet. So and that other one is the one that has that innovation that answers your question. The aero clubs are the least risky, lowest capital requirement starting point. And that's why I've built this overall arc of business model to address all of these opportunities. So the aero clubs are the start. And they naturally then grow into the network of scheduled business jet flights. Let's talk about that just for a second. Today, I'll talk about the US market because I know that best. If you're a business traveler, it's getting more and more frustrating, more and more costly, more and more difficult, less reliable, more frustrating to get around on the airlines for business travel. And not only that, if your travel is to smaller cities, you might as well forget airline travel. They either don't go there or they take 3 stops to get there, right? So then you're forced into road travel, which is not a pleasant thing either anymore. You're forced, right now, the airlines are the only real solution. But the delays are getting worse all the time. Now we're seeing the crumbling ATC infrastructure here in the US is rearing its ugly head. It's going to get worse, but the traffic keeps increasing. I recognized in the early 80s when I was working with the United during the transition from deregulation or from regulation to deregulation, that the market or the volume of traffic was increasing rapidly, but the infrastructure wasn't. And if you think about it, that's only natural. The infrastructure is the airport, the access roads, the parking, all that takes a long time to develop. It's political, right? Funding takes forever. Environmental impacts takes forever. I saw in the early 80s it was never going to keep up. And it hasn't. And that's one of the main causes of the poor system we have out here right now. And it's only going to get worse. So back in the early 80s, I came up with the concept, and I've been developing it ever since. I did some seed on a couple of times on it over the years, but the solution is to take a corporate flight department and make it available to more people. Because if you have a corporate flight department, let's say you work for a big company, forget the airlines, right? You're going to drive out to your local airport, easy drive, park your airplane in the hangar, get on the airplane, zoom your way nonstop to where you want. It's the way to do it.
Exactly.
I've developed a business model that allows many more people. In other words, the mid-level manager type person with his travel budget to be able to afford to do just that. He makes a couple of compromises. One big compromise is he or she's got to travel on a schedule that isn't on demand if you have your own corporate flight department.
Yeah.
That's the only compromise. So if you can work your travel into a schedule, which is a typical business travel schedule, out in the morning, back in the evening, then this service is for you. And the cost per trip is about airline, least airline first class. So it's not real expensive. And it offers much more reliable service, much more comfortable, efficient service, safer service, because those big dangers, big risks at the airlines that nobody talks about that I identified in false security, we fix those and by the way, the name we've given to this model is Air City. So the basic concept is about a little more than half of the population of the United States lives in the top 50 market areas, metro areas in the US. So you set up flight operation and a fixed base operation that has 50 business jets based there at that operation. And in the morning, those business jets take off and fly out to the other 50 cities and stay there all day. And in the evening, they fly back. So that everybody all the members, this is a membership, all the members have out in the morning, back in the evening, business jet service to the top 50 cities in the U.S. The demand for that is incredible. The numbers are incredible. For example, from between Chicago and New York, every day, 10,000 people travel over that route on the airlines. Just one. This Air City, if it had 100 members in Chicago who flew to New York twice a month, for example, that makes it work. So it's real doable. And the resources are there, the aircraft there, again, talked about blind spots. You have to know what kind of airplane to go buy to apply to this, to deploy on this model, or it won't work. But they're available. So that's that middle step. Once you have that kind of base of operation going, and each one of those is also an aero club. It's got the personal flyers based there. You've got a country club clubhouse on every airport that supports the members for the community membership retention, but it's like the airline club that they provide, but on steroids, much better and bigger.
Yeah.
When you have that, the personal flying, the business jet network, then the next logical step is flying internationally. And by the way, that model can be applied in Europe, Middle East, Asia. an Air City model. So we would
Okay.
apply that across the world and then
Mm.
tie it all together with international travel. And here's that innovation that you asked me about that excites me the most. That's the hypersonic airplane. Now, let me define that in case any of your viewers have not been aware of that. I'm sure they've been hearing about hypersonics because that's really big in the defense area right
Mm.
now. Billions and billions of dollars are being
Mm.
invested in hypersonic weapons and vehicles and fighter planes and bombers. And as we all know, that investment in military capability filters into commercial aviation very quickly, right? Almost
Mm.
directly or simultaneously. It so happens billions of dollars are today and have for the last 7 or 8 years are being invested in that commercial application of hypersonic technology. And there
Okay.
are 4 or 5 OEMs around the world, but I've got it narrowed down to right now 2 that I think have winning designs for business jet size airplanes that can take off from a business jet airport and fly at 6,000 miles an hour to wherever they're going.
Mm.
So now you've got your capability of going to Chicago, Beijing in 2 hours instead of 14. But those airplanes, those hypersonic business jets, are going to revolutionize global travel, right? And the airlines will get them eventually, but the airlines are not probably noticed. They're not risk takers. They're not
Not at all.
pioneers anymore. They used to be,
Yeah.
but they'll have them eventually. And the SST, by the way, we haven't talked about that supersonic. There's a little niche stepping stone in there, but it's another issue. And also, eVTOLs, the electronic vertical takeoff and landing. I look at those as another type of aircraft that fit into the Aero Club as an aircraft for people to fly, but also then it's a last mile link in the
Mm.
business jet network. So then the hypersonic airplanes will fly at about 170,000 feet and at about 6,000 miles an hour. And as I mentioned earlier, to have an aerospace plane, you have to fly a little higher and a little faster, but it's the same vehicle. So now it's
Mm.
just an evolution in development rather than a revolution in development from hypersonic to aerospace plane. So
Mm.
these OEMs are predicting that by the end of this decade, which by my math is 5 years out, and
Yeah.
as you look at where they're at in their development stages, they're probably a little optimistic, but I think within 10 years for sure. And the drivers are there, the military money, and all that's really needed is a launch customer for
Mm.
the commercial version of the hypersonic airplane. And I'd like to be the launch customer to drive that. But once we have that and have that network running and that operational experience, it's easy to drive that last little step up to the aerospace plane. And that opens up that travel low Earth orbit. And when you think about it, that's like the railroad barons in the 1800s. That's the opportunity. You're opening up a whole new frontier with all of the things that can be done in space, clean energy generation, manufacturing, research and development, not to mention tourism and many other things. And also, when you get to low Earth orbit, you're halfway to anywhere in the solar system in terms of energy and time or energy and cost. They will become the terminals, the transfer terminals for flights to Mars. So Elon might
Mm.
finally get to Mars after he rides up to low Earth orbit on one of our aerospace planes. And that's the arc of
Mm.
the opportunities I see in business aviation.
Yep. And it's all believable. It's not Star Trek or make believe. You've structured it and actually that it's available basically today. It just needs the implementation to take us a little bit further. So that's
What
a
it
great example
needs,
of
oh, excuse me, what it needs is just what your audience is, investors. It needs the people who are willing to invest to make it happen. Yes, the technology's there. All of the tools we need to do it are there. The resources are there. The models have been built and vetted and worked over and over and over. And the financial projections have been done. So now it's time to put the fuel in the tank.
Yep. Perfect. Perfect. So, Captain Cook, where can the listeners find your book, your AI tools, and learn more about your work and connect with you as a whole? Where do we find more about you?
I think the best way to find out or learn a little bit more about the books and how to get them, is go to David C. Koch, no dots or anything. My name, David C.
Yeah.
but just davidccook.com. I'm sorry, that
Okay.
one's just davidccook.com. That's where they can find out more about the books. And right now, I'm working with Todd to finance these operations. So I think that would be the other answer, is get together with Todd to learn more about the details of what we're doing.
Perfect. And then any final words of encouragement or caution for aviation curious investors?
I'd say that the encouragement would be the opportunities are there. There are many more than I'd mentioned. Most of those are more niche, but they're solid. And Todd's working several of those. So there's plenty of opportunity. That's not the problem. But the caution is, as I've been saying over and over, you got to know what you're doing. So either learn it yourself, spend the time, get the education, or get together with people who you can trust who know the business.
Perfect. So this has been a very fascinating, informative, and encouraging conversation with you. Thank you for giving your time to share your knowledge and wisdom and your experience with our audience. And yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to close out now. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And I definitely encourage you to connect with David in the future and follow what he's doing. He's a very fascinating and inspiring man. And I'm just blown away by the content you've been able to provide today. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure. It's always fun talking about what you're passionate about, right? And the fact that you're an aviation enthusiast just amps it up about 3 or 4 orders of magnitude. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to your members.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to close out now. So thanks very much, everybody. And I'll see you again on our next episode when we've got another phenomenal sort of guest speaker that we're talking about a subject very close to our hearts, aviation investments. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.